So this is gonna be a bit of a longer video and mostly interesting to you if you're interested in the Angular space or Angular ecosystem in general, or if you're an Angular developer, of course. Now you can still stick around if you're not, because a lot of the tech that I'm gonna show today is very easily translatable to other technologies as well, even though we're gonna show it today on an Angular project. So what I want to do is kind of compare the NX CLI and the Angular CLI specifically for Angular development. And I want to show you a bit like how similar they are, so the similarities between the two, which makes it very easy for an Angular developer today to switch to NX. But then I also want to show you how additional power comes with NX to your Angular workspace. So some additional features that NX provides that are super valuable when it comes to Angular development, and also it opens up a lot of more possibilities as you keep growing your Angular application. Ready? Let's check it out. So first of all, let's have a look at how we can create a new workspace. So I have here on the right-hand side the Angular CLI in just a folder, and here we have a folder specifically where we're gonna set up our NX CLI-based project. So let's start with the Angular CLI, and I'm using npx because I don't have it installed globally. So I just invoke here that add Angular CLI, new, and the name of the project, my ng app. And so this will now install the latest version of the Angular CLI, or basically pull it down and immediately invoke the new functionality here, which is gonna scaffold a new project for me. And so here we get already a couple of questions. So do we want to have Angular routing? Sure, why not? Different questions about the style sheet. Now I'm gonna keep it as simple as possible here. And then you can see a new application here gets generated for us. So let's switch over to NX and have a look what the setup process looks like there. So again, I invoke npx, then I invoke the create NX workspace command here. I usually append at latest to make sure I don't get a locally cached version. And then I give it a name of my application again. So my ng app. Now here I could already influence that I want to create an Angular application by passing a specific preset. I could say Angular standalone or Angular monorepo, depending on where I want to start. Now I want to start with a standalone setup, which means this is a single project workspace that is exactly the same structure as the Angular CLI. Now, if I don't know this preset, I can also navigate through by basically just invoking here the CLI, which will then ask me a couple of questions. So it asks me which stack do I want to use, and there we have Angular as one of the different options. So I go with Angular, and then here again, I go with standalone. Now, standalone not to be confused with the Angular standalone API, but rather this creates a single project workspace. So exactly what you would have for the Angular CLI, and so it makes it very easy to compare here. Again, for the style sheet format, I just want to keep it simple. Now, what NX in addition asks me compared to the Angular CLI is like which test runner do I want to use for end-to-end testing or more functional testing. And so here we have Cypress and Playwright. Let me just go with Cypress for now. It also asks me about whether I want to use the standalone components API from Angular. So let's go with that. Let's get all the new goodies. Do I want to add routing? Yeah, for sure. Do I want to add distributed caching to make my CI faster? Yeah, sure. And I'm going to go into more detail here. So for now, let's not enable this such that we can then add it in later. So I open up both of them in VS Code, where here the left-hand side is the NX workspace and the right-hand side here is the Angular CLI workspace. So let's have a look at the structural differences. Let's start with the source folder first of all. And you can already see these are almost perfectly identical. There's one test setup that differs here, and we will in a second see why. But other than that, we have the exact same setup. We have here the Angular application setup, like different Angular modules. We don't have that module here because I did set up the NX workspace to use the standalone API from Angular. So we just have standalone components here compared to ng modules. We could have done the same thing also for the Angular CLI. I just didn't provide the proper flag there. And since NX asked me here, I just immediately jumped into the standalone API setups. If you go further down, same thing, right? You have the main entry point, which only differs here because we have chosen here the standalone API versus just the classic setup of using ng modules. So how do we build this application? Well, for the Angular CLI, you just run npx ng build. And this now builds your application directly. Now for NX, we can do exactly the same. The only difference is we don't invoke ng, but rather NX and then build, and it will also run application build. So how does this work? Well, for the Angular CLI, we usually have the Angular JSON, which defines a build target in here. So you can see here, there's like the project section, my ng app, which has a build target, which uses here the Angular Devkit build Angular. And for NX, we have a similar situation where we have a project JSON file rather than an Angular JSON, but it has the exact same structure or very similar structure. We have here for this project a build target defined, which also here happens to use the exact same Angular Devkit builder. So we use the same underlying mechanism to build our Angular application. Now, why do we have a project JSON here? The reason is that NX chooses to have one such configuration per project, while the Angular CLI approach is to have a single Angular JSON with one project's node where all the projects live in here. Now in this case, we just have one project, so the Angular CLI node will just have that one project inside. And similarly for an X workspace, we just have one project JSON at the very root. But we will later see that once we convert, for instance, to a monorepo or have local libraries, we will have multiple of these project JSON files. And the nice thing there is that every project will have its own project JSON file with its own configuration that just applies to that single project, compared to having one single Angular JSON file at the root, which potentially contains the configuration of all the different projects that you have in your workspace. Now, this is a very big point in terms of scalability, as you have more team members working on a potentially larger workspace, also just for the purpose of avoiding merge conflicts. So at the build part here, we are exactly the same. The only difference that we can already highlight is that what happens if I run the ng build again here on the project, it will just go and build it again. Now Angular has some sort of caching mechanism underneath, which it here stores in this Angular version here, where it has some Angular Webpack and Babel cache that can be reused partially to rebuild the project, which speeds it up a bit. If we do the same here for the NX workspace and run NX build, you can see it's immediate, like it took only 34 milliseconds. And so what the NX CLI does here is it is able to cache the entire computation, because we didn't really change any configuration or any source files. So it just directly returns the output here again, as well as the this folder output that got generated before. And it also leverages the Angular CLI based cache, obviously, because we use the same mechanism to build it underneath. So let's explore for further things. What about testing? Now, if we run test here, we just run ng test again. And this will here pre-compile our application. And in the current configuration here, the Angular CLI will use Karma to set up the test. So what happens behind the scenes is a browser window opens, Karma tests run, and they spit out here the result, 3 success. Now this one has been launched in watch mode by default, so let me just close this here in this terminal. If we go to the NX project, we can just run NX test, very similar again. And this will use Jest behind the scenes to run our tests locally here. You can already see Jest is faster here than the actual Karma output. And to be noted here is that the Angular CLI is currently looking into experimental support also for Jest. So this might be coming in the future, but at the time of this recording of the video, it's not there yet. Clearly, if you prefer to use Karma in your project for whatever reason, you can totally do so. Even for NX, you can just provide the according test runner flag to choose Karma instead of Jest, which is the default in the NX CLI setup. So next thing, linting. Very similar again. Let me run here ng lint. Now here you can see the Angular CLI right now doesn't ship with a default linting setup out of the box. So whenever you run lint the first time, it will ask you to pre-configure it. And so obviously we want to install here ESLint. And so this is now going to install it locally. It also asks about adding this Angular CLI, the Angular ESLint schematic project, which helps like configure the linting specifically for this Angular project. And so let's install these packages. And so here what happens is that it will also add now a lint target here to our project, such that we can now invoke it. So you can see here is the test and now also the lint target. So we can just here invoke ng lint. And now the linting will obviously happen and the linting will pass for the project here. On the NX side, NX already ships with ESLint configured. So it uses the exact same mechanism for the linting process. And so you can see it already works out of the box. Again, here, If we rerun, caching obviously hits. If we rerun here, we would relint the application. So let's have a look at end-to-end testing. Now, end-to-end testing can have different meanings actually, depending on how you interpret it. Like end-to-end testing can be going really end-to-end. So from your application, invoking a REST API, whatever kind of technology you use there, hitting the database, returning that and visualizing it in the user interface on the front end. So this would be a real full round trip. That one involves quite some setup to make sure these are not brittle. On the other side, end-to-end testing can also happen locally in your application, meaning you want to end-to-end test a full user flow where you launch an application in a browser, you click a button, add some text to the input, and actually visualize whether that is being processed properly locally, while you might still mock out the actual invocation of the endpoint, so a REST API, for instance. So this makes these tests much more stable on the other side and really useful because you cover a lot of different aspects. Now, if I run end-to-end tests here in the Angular CLI, what will happen is a similar situation to the linting before. Previously, Angular CLI shipped with Protractor, which kind of is a bit of an older technology, was really useful once in a while, but now it kind of got replaced and deprecated. So now the Angular CLI doesn't ship with that out of the box, but it rather gives you the opportunity to configure one of the following here. So Cypress, Nightwatch, or pure WebDriver IO. Now I can go with Cypress here for now, but you can obviously choose whatever works best for you. Again, here the schematic wants to be installed from Cypress, that is pre-configuring our application with an end-to-end test. And then we get a couple of different questions here for setting up Cypress, the end-to-end test, target, as well as component testing. So once we've done that, we now get a new end-to-end target here in our application, but we also get here a Cypress configuration with our end-to-end test in here. So to launch this now here on the Angular CLI side, we can now actually run ng end-to-end. And the second time around now, it already has Cypress installed. So we'll launch now the dev server in watch mode. We'll open up Cypress behind the scenes. And so you can choose your browser and start your end-to-end test, which will then run basically on your project. So on the NX side here, we have a slightly different situation where we already have an end-to-end project. Now we have chosen to set this up with Cypress, but you could also use Playwright when you set up this project initially. So this is already pre-configured to work with our application. The difference is when we invoke this with end-to-end, and this end-to-end target exists on the end-to-end project rather than our application, because this is part of launching this project here. And so the project is called end-to-end, unfortunately. And so we have an NX end-to-end that we can run. So if I invoke this, this is not configured to be launched in watch mode by default. So it's much more handy because you now just run it in your local console in a terminal output without actually opening up the Cypress watcher and IDE. You can obviously do so by just passing the watch --watch flag, and then you have the exact same experience, which is usually very handy for debugging purposes. All right, so until now, both of them have been kind of the same. So the NX CLI, for instance, comes already pre-configured with the linting and end-to-end testing, and it also uses Jest for testing, while the Angular CLI uses Karma right now, but Jest seems to be coming. So the experience is pretty much similar. You run ng build on the one hand side, NX build on the other hand. The project configuration is also almost the same. So there's an Angular CLI on the one hand side, a project JSON on the other side. Both of them use a concept of an underlying package, so-called builder or executor on the other hand side, of abstracting away some of the lower level details. So it's much easier for you to configure a new build. There's some key difference already in the sense that NX already comes with more stuff. So it already also has a prettier config for you to make sure your code formatting works nicely and you don't have to argue about tabs and spaces. But it's also a key differentiator in the sense of having a caching mechanism of your computation. So as you have seen, the linting and testing and building and potentially also custom commands that you add can be cached, which has a significant impact on the speed overall. But there's much more, and this is where we're going from now on, where NX adds things on top where the Angular CLI doesn't have it just yet. So going back to our workspace, let me here close the side of the Angular CLI and keep focusing here mostly on the NX CLI workspace. So one thing I want to explore a bit is how NX adds more generators to your workspace. Generators are schematics, Angular schematics in the NX language, and they allow you to scaffold code or configuration or integrate with new tooling. And some of them are really handy. To invoke these generators, we do it exactly the same way as you would do in an Angular world. So you would do ng generate for an Angular CLI, but you can just use nx generate for the NX workspace. And then you give it again the package that you want to use for invoking the generator. So in this case, we can use nx Angular. And then we have here set up Tailwind, for instance, that allows us to configure Tailwind for our project. So we can invoke it. It will ask me where to configure the Tailwind setup. Let's say my ng app, and now it will add the Tailwind configuration to that project and make sure it sets it up in a way that it works for us. So you can see here, for instance, we get Tailwind config here set up, and it also did all the adjustments that were needed here in the package JSON and in the style CSS to make sure this works. Similar things are for Storybook. So what we could do is generate a Storybook setup for our application here. So similarly, we can just run nx generate again, nx Angular, and in this case, we call it Storybook configuration. And I'm using the dry run to not effectively run it, but just show you what it would look like. And so here again, we choose the project and we get a bunch of different questions asked with which the NX generator here does for us. For instance, do you want to have Storybook interaction tests, which is a new way of automated testing provided by Storybook. And so this would be set up for us. Do you want to have stories generated already for the existing components? So you can see a lot of work is being taken away from you by exactly having such setup and additional generators. So how do you find these though, if you don't know which ones exist and where to use them and how to use them? Well, one obviously approach is to go to nx.dev/docs into the documentation. But what the NX team also did is create a dedicated extension for VS Code and IntelliJ and WebStorm that helps you navigate an NX workspace. So this extension is called NX Console. And if you open it up, it provides a set of facilities to actually help you kind of run tasks, for instance, run the build, or also in our case, what we are most interested in, generate new stuff. As if you click that generate menu, then based on the plugins that you have already installed, so these packages like NX Angular or also the Angular Schematics itself, it finds them and you can now search them and run these generators. For instance, for Cypress, we can just search Cypress and it will list here the Cypress configuration for component testing that we can generate, which we have already done in this workspace. Similarly, also the ones that we have seen for Storybook or just for creating new components, where we can use here the NX Angular generator that can help you set up a new component here, or even a component test for Cypress. Now, once you click these, the generator opens up in a form where you can now fill out the details and then click generate and directly have that code generated. You can always copy the command. So for further use, for instance, if you have to do that multiple times and just change a couple of flags, it's very handy to copy the underlying generator command such that you can then just paste it in your terminal and get going much more quickly. So as you listen along, you hear me talk about generators instead of schematics, or project JSON instead of Angular JSON, or executor instead of builder. So you might be wondering, can I not run them? Like, can I not run an Angular schematic or an Angular builder in NX? Well, the Angular builder we have seen already works. So we actually referenced here in our config, if we go back to our project JSON, you can see here in the executor, we actually leverage an Angular builder that comes from the Angular Devkit package. But underneath, NX actually has its own Devkit, which is optimized in the sense of being able to work much more easily with it, having promises support out of the box or being that native primitive there. It also, however, has very similar concepts than the Angular Devkit. So there's a virtual tree, it allows for dry runs and much more. And in order to make sure that these two things are compatible, there's a compatibility layer. So very similar as we here are able to run the executor, we can also run Angular Schematics. In fact, if I search here for component, you can see the add Angular Schematics component. And if I here give it a name like Hello World, and the project here will be my ng app, let me copy here the command, then you will see that I can run this through the NX CLI. So I can just run NX generate and then provide whatever Angular schematic I want to passed through NX, NX automatically detects that and actually runs it through this compatibility layer to make sure it still works. So even though the Angular schematic here expects, for instance, just a single Angular JSON, and in an NX workspace you might have a project JSON, this compatibility layer will make sure to translate that properly. But there is even more than just generators. For instance, a common thing that you often need here in your builder configuration is the ability to pass a custom Webpack config. And there are custom packages out there, custom Angular builder packages that allow you to do that. In NX, we have a bunch of these automations already built in. So instead of having the Angular Devkit builder here, you can actually also use the add NX Angular Webpack browser package. And this has further properties. It has the same properties as the Angular builder itself expects, but also more. If we go to the documentation to packages, Angular, and then we scroll to the executors, we can search for this Webpack browser builder. And this has the ability, for instance, to pass directly in that custom Webpack config, a path to a custom Webpack config that it then extends with the one that is already being provided by the underlying builder, the Angular builder. So there's a lot of these utilities, be it generators to integrate Tailwind or Storybook, or having a custom executor that allows you to customize your Webpack config. These are just examples, or some of the examples that NX has built in, because NX team has found it extremely valuable when it comes to working with Angular code bases, in particular larger code bases. But what about the ng update command? The Angular CLI is kind of famous for having introduced that command to allow you to automatically update your Angular CLI, your configuration, but also the actual framework of Angular and source code to the latest version. And they do that by allowing you to run ng update, which then will trigger a series of code modification scripts that adjust your configuration, adjust your source code if needed, obviously update your package JSON and PM packages to the latest version. And this is crucial if you want to have your people and your developers be up to date with the latest version, such that they get the latest security patches, but it allows also the team itself, like the Angular team at this point, to iterate more quickly because they make sure that people can keep up with them. Now, NX has exactly the same concept. It is called NX Migrate. So let me show it to you quickly on a project here, which has on purpose an older version of NX here and also of Angular. So we have here a workspace that uses Angular 15.2 and it also uses the older NX 16 version, while we're now already at 16.7. Now to update this workspace, instead of running ng update, because we don't really have ng installed here, but rather we use NX, we run npx nx migrate latest, meaning we want to migrate to the latest version. NX is now going to analyze your workspace, the installed packages in the package JSON, and it will build up a list of scripts to be run. The main difference between the NX migrate command and the ng update command is that the NX migrate command comes in multiple steps. So it will first show you what will need to be done. You can then intervene in the sense of adjust it to your workspace. And this is crucial if you have a large workspace. And then you can adjust it and then actually run it to apply it to your workspace underneath. This also allows you to keep this script and run it multiple times if needed, for instance, on outdated PRs that have been forked off the main branch before the update has happened and landed in main. So as you can see, at the end of this first command, what we get is a package JSON being updated and a migrations JSON being generated. So the package JSON is similar to what you would expect in the sense of having the new updated versions in it, both for Angular itself, but also for NX and related technologies like ESLint and the TypeScript parse, or in this case also Jest. Now the migrations JSON here has been placed at the root of our workspace, and this contains a series of migration scripts. The Angular CLI underneath does exactly the same thing. It just doesn't expose it to you, but rather just runs it right away. Now this allows you to look into it, inspect what is being done by reading here the description or even looking at actual implementation. And then you can run it on the workspace. To run it, just follow the instructions here, which means running here, run migrations. This will now pick up this migration file and run all these scripts here on this workspace. So after the migration has run, we can see the different changes that have been applied. In this specific run, some changes have been added here to the main TS, so some code logic has been extracted into new app config TS, for instance. And this works pretty well. If you look here at this burst diagram, which shows the distribution of the NX installations, you can see that the majority of people are already on the latest 2 versions of NX, on the latest 2 majors. And this is thanks to such an upgrade mechanism, which allows to easily upgrade to the latest version. So NX does very similar to the Angular CLI, first of all, update itself, but then also update related technologies, which include Cypress, Storybook, Jest, ESLint, and potentially others that you might be using, and obviously also runs the underlying Angular upgrades if they are applicable. Now, if you're wondering which version of NX you need to use for which version of Angular, NX is actually compatible with all the latest LTS versions. So meaning you can use the latest version of NX, but still have an older version of Angular going back to version 14 at the time of this recording. One big differentiator between NX and the Angular CLI is that NX allows you to start small, so in a very similar fashion as the Angular CLI with a single project workspace, but then it helps you grow as your needs grow. So as your workspace gets bigger, as you maybe onboard multiple teams or more team members, you will need different mechanisms to make sure your code base keeps growing and keeps scaling. And so let's have a look at some of these mechanisms. So first of all, when we have a bigger application, usually what happens is that you have some local folders in here which manage your domain. Let's say you have a folder for products or the product list, for orders, authentication, some maybe shared utilities or UI components, and you usually group them within this source folder. Now, this is a very lightweight way of grouping these things and separating these things, but at the same time, it is very easily to mess it up by having a lot of interdependencies between them. So one thing that NX allows you to do in such a situation is generate local libraries. Now, NX being also a tool for monorepos, the concept of libraries is already built in, but we can also apply this to such a single project workspace as we have in this case. So we can just generate such a local library using the NX Angular library generator, and let's call this products. And I want to generate this into a directory called features. And I also want to pass standalone. In this way, we use the Angular standalone API rather than creating ng modules. And so now you can see we get this features folder and our products library in there. Let's generate a new one also for orders and potentially another one for our UI components. And the directory there might be something like features shared, because UI components would probably be shared across all these different areas. And so now you can see how our workspace shapes. Each of these is a library in the sense that it is consistent, it has an entry point, it has inside components. This entry point allows you furthermore to change the visibility. So only what is being exported from this entry point can also be used outside. So this gives you another visibility mechanism in your workspace. And all of these libraries, as we generate them, are being directly referenced down here in our TypeScript base config via these TypeScript path mapping aliases. Now, these allow you to import them very easily into our application. So let's go to our app component, for instance. And so we can just import here our features orders component. So by segmenting your codebase in this way, it allows you to scale it much more easily. Because first of all, you can assign team members or entire teams to a subset of these libraries so they can work independently on them. And we can even test them independently. So each of these projects is literally a fully worthy project in the Angular workspace here, powered by NX. And so to run them, each of them has a project JSON with according targets like testing, linting, and if they're buildable, even a build target. And so the name here, for instance, is feature orders. And so to test just this specific library, I can just run NX test, very similarly as we did before for the application, but now appending here the name of this project. And so this would now run the test for this project. As you can see, if I run it again, it hits directly the cache. So all these things also apply for these sub projects or local libraries that we have. You can then also visualize these libraries by using the NX graph. So if you go to the browser and then open up here the local browsing of the NX graph, you can see the different nodes of our workspace. These are literally the projects that we have right now. You can also see that these are not connected yet to anything, while the features orders is something that we imported into my app. And so therefore it is connected here via that imported app component. And these features are really helpful for debugging your workspace. And as it grows, also to inspect it and see how the different feature areas are connected to each other. So what you can then also do is to have some sort of boundaries around these features. Because again, as you have multiple team members working on a project, what you might want to do is, for instance, impose rules where someone like working in the features UI components should not be able to import from something like features products or features orders, but they should be able to do that vice versa. Because clearly UI components are shared across domain areas, while a component that lives within the product area shouldn't probably be used here in the UI components, which is a more smaller, fine-grained UI component living there. Now, if you want to learn more about this, go to our NX docs, and there is a chapter in the core features about module boundaries and how these can be applied to your code base and how you can leverage them to have a more maintainable code base in the long run. As your code base grows and as you start modularizing it more and more with such local libraries, you might reach the point where you actually might want to even have another application, whether that's another Angular application or even another React application or even just a mobile application that lives alongside your main desktop product. Now, given that NX is a monorepo tool in the end as well, it allows you to easily transform your existing single project workspace into a monorepo workspace. Now, while you could do this manually, we have created a generator to do that and help you with it. So you can just run nx generate convert to monorepo. And what this will do now is convert this existing workspace into a monorepo workspace. As you can see, now we have an apps folder, which has still our end-to-end test in it. It has our main application, which has been transferred into this subfolder here. And we still have our libraries that live inside there. All the rest of the application behavior remains exactly the same. So we can still go ahead and say npx nx build. The only difference now is that we need to provide it the name of the application because we could potentially have multiple of them. And clearly you can now also add a second application. So we can just go here and run a generator application. So we choose here the application from the NX Angular package, my second app. And then we choose different options as we have done before, like whether we want to have standalone, whether we want to have routing. And then we just generate our second application into our workspace. And having a monorepo workspace, we could now easily import the libraries that are still exported here via the tsconfig-based JSON file into our second application as well. So some of these libraries might actually be shareable or might just need little retouching or refactoring to be made shareable between multiple applications and not just a single one. While other libraries might still remain for just a single application, which is totally fine. And from here, we have even more advanced feature capabilities. For instance, to add module federation. Because one thing that we did here is like having our application and split up our libraries, and we can make those libraries individually buildable such that we also benefit from the NX caching. Or we could have module federation help us split up even our application build itself into smaller pieces, so that we have like a small section of our application which is just for the orders part, those just for the products part, and so on. In the description, you will find a video that goes step by step into using an existing Angular application and leveraging module federation to split it up. But the process basically is, again, leveraging some of the generators. So I can go here and say nx generate, and then write module federation, and then choose here the setup module federation for our second application, for my second app. I can choose here the application, then fine tune a couple of different things if I want to. So this will be our host. You could even have the routing configuration set up for you. And once you hit generate, it will now add a module federation configuration into our existing Angular application. So you can see here the different setup about the name, and there are no remotes just yet. The Webpack config that is needed. Notice the exact configuration here for Webpack is in the NX Angular package, but you can obviously take this and further customize it to your needs. And there is the corresponding production one as well. And as a second step, we could now go ahead and generate remotes. So we could here say remote, call this products remote. We can choose the host application, which in this case is my second application, and then generate this new remote. So now see we get a products remote. Similar to the other applications, we also get an end-to-end test for it. So we could test this specific remote individually. And also our my second application here got updated by referencing properly this remote, which then gets read by the corresponding configuration to set it up and wire it up properly. So you can see how these generators can help you get up to speed really easily. And then you can dig in and actually configure and tailor it to your own needs much more. So all these features are here to make you more productive. But sometimes you even need to further customize it to your organizational situation, because maybe you have a specific way of how you set up your Angular app or Angular libraries. So you might want to customize that even more. Now, if you go to the NX docs, there is an entire section about extending NX for your own needs. And there's actually a big community behind that creates such plugins that allow you to integrate some of the tooling out there and third-party tools into NX workspaces to make it working with them even more pleasant. But you could actually go ahead and create your own local plugin, meaning a plugin that just lives in your NX workspace to automate a specific part of it, like creating a new library in a particular way. So check out the link in the description for a video that walks you step by step through creating such a plugin to automate the generation of new packages in an NX workspace. Now, we have seen a ton of different features that NX adds on top of the Angular CLI without even speaking about speed and CI. So one of the goals that Angular CLI also had is integrate Bazel into Angular applications with the main purpose of speeding up your Angular compilation, but also as your workspace grows and your Angular applications get bigger to speed up your CI. Now, Bazel is an excellent system. It is the open source variant of the Google internal Blaze tool, which helps manage their gigantic monorepo. However, on the other hand, Bazel is really configuration heavy and it's really hard to actually adjust, specifically for Node.js-based tooling. Now, NX tries to aim for a similar thing, but in a more ergonomic way. So we have already seen the NX caching that takes place. So if you open up the NX JSON at the root of your workspace, there will be a section about caching. And here you can see the cacheable operations that have been defined that you could potentially adjust based on what targets you have or add even further ones. And what this means is, for instance, that if we run multiple tasks in our workspace, let's say we want to run the tests and the lint targets for all of our projects, NX will first of all parallelize them in the most efficient way. But at the same time, what this also means is that if we rerun, for instance, all these commands, it will only take 170 milliseconds. And this is thanks to NX computation caching mechanism. So what this does is basically have a different set of inputs, obviously the source code, environment variables, and some other configuration files. And then every time you run a task on your project or multiple projects, it will compute a hash and store the results locally. Both the console log output, but also potentially artifacts that are being produced. For instance, for a build, it will store the JavaScript artifacts. Now, this cache just lives locally in our node modules folder by default. So if you go in here in the caching, you will see an NX cache. And if we remove this cache and rerun the operation again, you will see it's not being cached, but rather recomputed. Now, obviously on CI, you want to have a persistent cache, such that in between PR runs, if some other person or some other PR has already computed that same result, our PR would be speed up by just copying over that cache into our own CI run, and therefore be much, much faster. Now you can do this via NX Cloud. To connect, you just run NX Connect, and this will now ask you whether you want to enable distributed caching with NX Cloud on CI. And so once you enable this, NX is going to install the NX Cloud package, and it also flips our runner here in the NX JSON to use the NX Cloud runner. If we now rerun the same computation, for instance, it will be computed the first time around because we changed some configuration, in this case our Cloud runner. But in this case, if I remove again the logs locally from our cache and rerun the computation again, it is still super fast because it got pulled down from the remote cache of NX Cloud in this case. You can even open up NX Cloud directly to get an insight into the run, to open up the different logs that have been produced by these runs that are searchable and filterable, for instance, based on failures that might have happened, which is extremely useful if you have a lot of different projects that run as part of the same CI run. So you don't have to go through cluttered CI logs and filter out failures that might have happened in some linting or testing process. You can also claim your NX Cloud workspace to get more insights into run statistics, like how much cache do you actually save as a whole per week, per day across the different runs. Now, aside from the distributed caching, you can also get the ability to distribute tasks across multiple machines. So for instance, if we go to our workspace, we can generate a new CI setup for instance, GitHub. In this case, there are other options available as well. And what this does is generate a new CI configuration for GitHub Actions that is able to use an NX Cloud runner and distribute tasks, in this case here, on multiple agents. So since NX has this notion of the graph behind the scenes, it is able to do such distribution across machines in the most optimal way, because it knows how the different tasks are being related, and that allows it to distribute these tasks on machines such that no task is blocking another one. It can also do this using historical data as well. So if there is long-running tasks, it will make sure those get on a separate machine such that they don't block further tasks to be scheduled on that machine, with the overall goal basically that the entire running time of the CI is as short as possible, and you don't have agents, for instance, that are waiting because other agents take long, having taken on long-running tasks on their machine. All right, we made it through. So I hope I could give you enough detail to be able to evaluate NX for your next Angular project and also understand what the differences are, but also where the similarities are. So as we have seen in this very beginning of the video, the NX CLI and the Angular CLI are really similar, also because the NX CLI has grown out of an Angular CLI extension basically to become its own CLI ultimately. And so that's where you see some of the similarities still, such as the structure of the project JSON compared to the Angular JSON, and the generators and schematics and executors and builders. They are very similar concepts. So for an Angular developer, it's really easy to transition. Also, if you start from a standalone workspace or a single project NX workspace, the setup is really similar to what the Angular CLI provides, with the difference that the NX CLI already gives you some of the end-to-end testing and linting and also prettier configuration built in, versus the Angular CLI opting for an approach where you have to install it once you need it. We've also seen additional generators that are present there in the NX CLI that you don't have right now in the Angular CLI, unless you use third-party installation, third-party schematics. And then we have seen how NX is really made for growing as your workspace grows, with the ability to create a structure of local libraries to modularize your code base, but also with the ability to actually then transition to a monorepo if you really need to have a monorepo at some point. So it gives you a lot of this freedom to grow with your workspace as you add more team members, as your application becomes bigger. So there's hardly a roadblock where at some point you cannot grow anymore because the tooling is stopping you. And that's exactly the goal of the NX team overall. There's more than 25 people working on NX, fully focused on making you more productive with various technologies. And that scaling doesn't end on the actual code base, but as we have seen also on CI, via mechanisms such as remote caching, distributing tasks across different machines, and there's actually much more coming. So I hope this kind of convinced you to look into NX, try it out. Let me know in the comments if you have further questions or further areas that you want to explore. Make sure you check out the description to links of other videos that can go more into depth of some of the concepts that we have just touched briefly during this overview video today. All right, folks, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.